Welcome to Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape podcast. Hosted by Dr. Holly Krutka, Executive Director of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. The show highlights SER's role supporting our mission to promote energy-driven economic development for the state of Wyoming.
Welcome back, listeners. The oil and gas industry plays an essential role in Wyoming's energy industry and is a vital component of the state's economy. This episode features Pete Obermueller. He's the president of the oil and gas advocacy organization in the state, the Petroleum Association of Wyoming. So welcome, Pete. Let's start with your background and how you came to be in your current position.
Thanks, Holly. Appreciate you inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. Yeah, so the Petroleum Association of Wyoming, just real quick, I mean, it's the only statewide trade association in Wyoming, represents all facets of the oil and gas industry. So that ranges in Wyoming from people who are still actually exploring for new resources, so the exploration side of oil and gas, and then the production side, the people who actually drill and bring it up out of the ground, and then pipeline transportation, take the product across the state and across the nation to everywhere that needs it, which is everywhere, and then also the downstream refining, the folks who turn the product into things that we use every day in our everyday lives all across the world. And then everybody kind of who orbits that space. So you've got engineers, petroleum engineers, you've got wildlife biologists, environmental consultants, attorneys, all the people who make it all happen, who don't necessarily work for a specific oil and gas company. So those are all my members in the Petroleum Association. And it's a great association. It's fun for a lot of reasons. I think my favorite part about it is Wyoming is somewhat unique in the sense that we really have, what I call Wyoming oil. You hear a lot about big oil. Mm-hmm. Wyoming doesn't have the big major, international oil and gas companies. We have, a lot of smaller guys, kind of big independent names you might have heard of, like Devon or Oxy, Occidental or Continental or those sorts of names. Mm-hmm. But on the global scale, those companies aren't massive.
They're not the big majors.
That's right. Yeah. When, you'll hear sort of negative press about big oil, and usually they're talking about, like Shell mm-hmm. or, those sorts of companies, which, I don't have any problem with Shell either, but they don't operate in Wyoming. Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. So in fact, about 85% of the oil and gas companies in Wyoming are classified as small businesses. And, there's about, probably my favorite stat is that, a full third of Wyoming's oil production every single year comes from about 350 companies who individually only produce, less than 1% of the total.
Wow.
So we just have an enormous amount of just Wyoming-based small businesses who produce, vast amounts of resources. And I really enjoy being able to advocate for all of them together. And what's awesome about Wyoming is that the bigger guys, the Devons and Oxys and those guys, recognize the importance of the small guys and their contribution, and it's vice versa. The small guys know that they can't really survive without the resources that the bigger guys contribute, and so we have one association that represents all of them. And surprisingly, that's kind of unique. Most other states have separate associations for the big guys and the small guys, and I like being able to talk to them all.
And that's interesting because I think having that number of small producers, it gives us a lot of opportunity as well. So we have the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute, which is part of the School of Energy Resources. It's not something that exists in every state, but when you have such a proportion of smaller producers, the state investing just a little bit to have a group that can help with technical studies and outreach and bring folks together around common issues, I think can make a real impact. So, and I think for us here at the School of Energy Resources, we're really grateful that a lot of those smaller companies and the mid-sized companies that you mentioned, they work with us on research. They let our students come visit their sites.
Right.
It's a lot easier to pull that off here, I think. So.
I think that's right. And what's amazing about what you all do here at SER and then also at EORI, it takes some of those sort of mid-sized, larger companies to partner mm-hmm. with the kind of, with the people and resources that you all bring to the table and that advance our capabilities of extracting resource in Wyoming. But I think about it in the longer term that, eventually, the usual order is that those larger guys, eventually move on or seek new resources or new projects, and they end up passing these fields down to those smaller companies that they themselves end up benefiting by, having access to technology that allows them to bring the resource out of the ground, even at small scale. And for Wyoming, it's just instrumental to have these small operators out there producing, what they call in the business marginal wells. But it's not marginal for Wyoming when you bring them all together, and all that technology transfer and best practices that EORI and SER works on with the larger guys ends up transferring down. And I'm not sure people quite understand what the longevity is of that from the work that you all do.
Sure. Yeah. And it's certainly, I think it's very motivating to us to know that we can ultimately work with entities that will result in an impact.
Right.
It's not just research.
Right.
So, and then the impact, we also, it goes both ways, and we're trying to help them, but we're doing this interview here in my office in the Energy Innovation Center, surrounded by the incredible facilities here at the University of Wyoming. And the oil and gas industry, obviously, in their contributions to the state's revenue are critical for us having all this. So in 2013, oil and gas production contributed an estimated $2.42 billion to state and local taxes.
That's right.
Can you talk about that? What goes into what different types of taxes are paid and the breakdown there?
Yeah, it's good and bad. It's
yes.
It's good for Wyoming's revenue. I will say, one of the things you often hear about Wyoming is, number one business climate, number one tax climate for business, all that kind of stuff. And that is true, except for oil and gas.
Right.
We're actually, according to a study done in Colorado, Wyoming's tax rates on oil and gas are the highest of the oil and gas producing states. Even you think about places that don't love oil and gas, like Colorado, our tax rates are double what Colorado's is. So it's interesting. But be that as it may, we're proud of what we contribute, and it comes mostly in two forms. The biggest one is essentially property tax. The word that we use, around the Capitol is called ad valorem, but essentially property. So the oil and gas that's under the ground is somebody's property. Somebody owns it, and we end up paying taxes on that property at a really high rate comparatively. So, without boring everybody to tears, essentially your house, you value your house, and then you only take a 9.5% of that value, and you pay taxes on 9.5% of the value of your house. Minerals like oil and gas and coal, you take the value of the oil and gas or coal, and you don't discount it at all. It's not 9.5%; it's 100%. So that's the biggest. That's the biggest tax bill, and that funds K through 12 education, and for the most part, that's 78% or something like that goes to Wyoming schools. So we're really proud of that. And then the other part of it is what you may have heard, your listeners probably have heard of. It's called the severance tax.
Yep.
And it's like the severance tax is essentially a corporate income tax. It's just it's only leveled on mineral companies. It's on the value of the essentially of the resource that they bring up. Severance. The reason it's called severance is you take oil and you bring it up out of the ground and you're severing it from Wyoming.
Right.
So you're paying essentially. My members are paying for the privilege of separating Wyoming's resources from Wyoming, and that's the other parts. Not quite as much as ad valorem or the property tax, but it's pretty significant. And the two of them combined make up the bulk of it. There's sales tax and other things, down below there, but those two are the bulk.
So I'm curious, every time I drive back from DIA, which I try not to do, but the flights don't work, I have to. And there is still so much oil and gas development right on the highway, on the way back. You see it. I think we're trying to do a study now to try to quantify what different areas like electricity, like taxes, like service industry, like how are those impacting? But do you have a sense like how much? I'm surprised there's so much development in Colorado when we consider ourselves a oil and gas friendly state, and they have, it seems like a lot of development right there.
It's kind of wild, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, what will really blow your mind is that California produces more oil than Wyoming as well. And I think if you think of states that are sending Valentines to oil and gas, California.
It's not on the list.
It's not on the list.
Not getting a Valentine card.
Yeah, it's amazing. So look, it's just it gets to the challenge in both at the federal level and the state level of trying to determine what's the appropriate regulations and policies and tax rates and all that for mineral extraction, because the number one thing you need is the resource, and you need it in places where it's accessible and it's not going to just absolutely destroy your balance sheet to produce it. And Wyoming, particularly in the Powder River Basin, has some pretty good places, but it's kind of remote and it's expensive. And if you think of the northern DJ, north of Denver, along the interstate or 85 or whatever you're driving up from DIA, it's a little bit easier to access there. The costs of production are a little bit lower, and their tax rate is lower, as I mentioned. But so I don't know. It's far be it from me to say it's an interesting dynamic that in general, people and policymakers in Colorado and California just love to hate oil and gas, but they produce it in spades.
Yeah.
So it's pretty interesting.
Well, let's talk about what we can do in Wyoming. Like, obviously, we as a state are supportive of oil and gas production, but it doesn't mean. There's still more work we can do. We're doing the Maui project. There's technical work. Let's talk about first. Let's focus on what the state can do. So talk about Office of State Lands and Investments. And is there anything that from a rules and regulation standpoint that could be done to kind of make it easier to do oil and gas production on state lands?
Yeah, absolutely. There's the state land. Every level of government is always behind technology development, and I think that's particularly true in oil and gas. Maybe not particularly true. It's probably true in every industry. I shouldn't say that, but but in oil and gas, what's happened is all of the regulations at the state level were written for a time when oil rigs went just straight down. They're just vertical wells. You dot the landscape, they drill straight down, and they can produce just right around a radius around that wellhead. And the rules at state lands worked for that. That was okay. Now, there's the technology has advanced. It's really a marvel, and all about this. Probably you know more about it than I do, but the ability now to drill down and then turn and go as far as 3 miles. That's happening in Wyoming now, 3 miles horizontally underground. And amazingly, Holly, I've talked to some of my members who are experimenting with, how at the end of a swimming pool, a swimmer will do that crazy turn underwater, that flip turn. Yeah, you can tell I'm not a swimmer, but they're working on flip turns in drilling as well, which is just that just blows my mind. Anyway, the rules don't account for all of that.
Right.
So and because Wyoming has such a fractured land ownership, thanks to all sorts of historical reasons from the federal government, the Wyoming being a land grant and then having these state sections and then mingled with private sections and federal sections, and the subsurface has different ownership than the surface and all of that. If you don't have regulations that account for that, it makes it really hard for a company to come in and lease with state lands, even though that would be the best for the state and usually the best for the oil and gas company. The rules just haven't kept up. In fact, they're so far behind now that they're an impediment to drilling on state lands. So some of my members tell me that everyone would rather be on private lands, but some of my members are telling me that it's even in some cases easier to work with the federal government than with state lands for drilling for oil and gas, which is that's not the way we should be operating in Wyoming.
Yeah. So what's the process for changing those rules then?
Well, this will put your listeners to sleep in a second, but it's essentially it has to follow the procedure, the Wyoming Procedures Act. it's not that hard to change the rules in Wyoming. You can do it. It just takes a little bit of leadership and willpower, and it does need, in my opinion, it needs a full rewrite. So it would take some time for people who, know a lot about A, how to drill, B, what the regulatory impediments are, and an agency that's willing and wants to do it, and working on what that structure would look like. And then it just follows a normal process for rulemaking in any government. A draft would go out, people could comment, and it works through that process until we finally come out the other end, hopefully with a better rules package that more aligns with where we are in oil and gas right now.
Okay. And so let's talk about that federal land then.
Yeah.
You brought it up.
Sure.
So you have likened the federal government to an absentee landlord that changes its mind every 4 years on how to manage its acreage.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's the best way really to describe it. And to be fair, I mean, we know that there are federal land managers that live and work in Wyoming. So I don't really mean to belittle their work. But, the Bureau of Land Management, operates in Washington, D.C. And, I spent time in Washington, D.C. I worked there for almost a decade. And I truly believe, Holly, that those of us who live and work in Wyoming and any of the public land states that we really do, we have both an obligation, but also just a blessing of being able to be near these lands and kind of understand how it works and kind of understand what multiple use looks like. And what you hear a lot in DC, and it's really a bipartisan thing, is that, this phrase that, public lands belong to all Americans. And if you live in Wyoming, that doesn't give you any special right. Technically, that's true. You can't argue with that. It's technically true, but it's not really fair, and it doesn't really, it's not really the reality of how we can make federal lands work, because sitting in DC or wherever, and just when I was working in DC, one of the members talking to my boss at the time from Virginia said the phrase, it's just stuck with me because I couldn't believe it. He said, look, my constituents will never visit public lands in Wyoming, but they like knowing that they're there. And I found that so insulting.
It's like more than half our state, too.
Yeah. So surface is about 48%. Surface is about 48%.
48%.
But subsurface is about 67%. Yeah. And so if you could take all oil, gas, and coal, I think it's somewhere in the order of like 78, 79% of all Wyoming's resources have a federal nexus.
Wow.
And we're basically out of places that don't touch federal minerals in some way. So we need their permission to do really anything. Yeah. And if they're not functioning at the federal level, then we can't function at the state level. So we need them to be firing on all cylinders. Otherwise, we can't get out of the gates.
I think I found it all really confusing because there are such strict rules on oil and gas production on federal lands that often it's kind of like the cleanest, best produced oil and gas in the country. Now, those restrictions might be an impediment in some cases, but generally, when it comes to leasing or allowing that production to happen, if the U.S., we're in a position where the U.S. and the world continue to use oil and gas. Why would you not get that return on investment, right? It's not, you're not increasing net production, and kind of just even seeing what Wyoming's like natural gas producers have done on the west side of the state with really lowering their methane intensity and kind of being best in class, not just in the U.S., but the world in terms of methane mitigation. It seems like something actually that should be rewarded, and it doesn't feel that way. So and I get it, like it's what the federal government can control, right? They can't control to the same level oil and gas produced on state or private lands. So there's a lot of meddling.
That's exactly right. And it's kind of bizarro world because I truly believe that if what you're interested in is if you're interested in just keeping oil and gas in the ground, period, no matter where it's from, then that's one thing.
Yeah.
And that's fine, whatever. But if what you're interested in is the recognizing the reality of the demand for oil and gas, but you're also interested in doing it in a sustainable way, then what the United States should really do is double down on public lands development, because you're exactly right. It's here that oil and gas is produced in the most sustainable way, I would argue, in the world. And if you're interested in helping the world meet its energy demand, and this, Holly, the demand is insatiable.
Yeah.
Insatiable.
Yeah.
Then doing it here is the place where we should focus for so many reasons. But they don't, and that's why Wyoming has whatever 12 rigs running, and North Dakota has like 38 or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, it's just we're throttled in that way.
So, okay, I know this is probably an impossible question, but is there a way to, do you have suggestions about how to overcome kind of the political swings in DC, at the federal level?
Yeah, I do. I mean, well, let me backpedal a little bit.
You can solve this.
We just have some bit of modesty. I mean, it does wildly change.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's a problem that's bigger than us for sure. But you look at the state of the bureaucracy, and agencies can quite literally interpret statutes 180 degrees opposite from each other, from one administration to the next. And it's pretty wild. That's got to be fixed by Congress. And I don't see that happening anytime soon. Yeah. But, on the Department of Interior side, I think there are some things that you could do that would help to stabilize it, and particularly stabilize it in a way that honors the people who live and work in public land states. And that would be, I don't know that the EPA does a lot of awesome things, but one of the things that the EPA does that I think is helpful is this this whole notion of primacy.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That's one awesome thing.
It is, yeah, and they set base rules, but then they turn that over to the state to say, as long as you're meeting these base rules, you guys can do what you think is best. And I don't see any reason why the Department of Interior couldn't follow that model. That for leasing,
but who would do that here?
Well, there's no apparatus to do it right now, because it doesn't happen right now.
Okay.
It's not like we could flip a switch and that would happen. But, the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality has proven over and over again that they have the capability and professionals to manage programs under the Clean Air Act. I have full faith that we could find the right people in Wyoming through the Oil and Gas Commission or others that could, manage programs under the Federal Land Management and Policy Act or the Mineral Leasing Act in the same way. And that would allow Wyoming, under some base rules, would allow Wyoming to make decisions more nimbly and closer to the people here. But honestly, it would allow Colorado the same. So, it would be a deferral to the states that might make some people uncomfortable. But look, I'm a cooperative federalism kind of guy. I like the states having more authority and being more in charge of these things. And
to your point, DEQ has proven that this primacy concept works, right? They have the same level of rigor in terms of the environmental standards and the threshold that companies have to meet. However, Wyoming can choose, how many people do we have working on permitting in a specific issue? So we can just go faster, even with the same level of rigor, because we've chosen to invest in that.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And it just, to go super wonky on you for 1 second, that people probably won't remember, but there's, everybody knows that the royalties that we pay on federal lands are shared between the feds and the state. There's this goofy 2% fee. So it's supposed to be 50-50, and people talk about it being 50-50. It's not quite 50-50 because the feds hold 2% as an administrative fee to manage, ostensibly to manage permitting and leasing and all that. Wyoming, if you took that 2% and gave it back to Wyoming, that would be that's approximately about between $40 and $44 million a year. Wyoming could do a lot of work at the agencies and permitting and all that with $44 million paid for by industry. You know what I mean? So it's not there's reachable things that could be done that would defer more to Wyoming, and I think Wyoming could do it just fine.
I agree. So in absence of that, since it hasn't happened yet, can you talk about the changes you've seen with the new federal administration, the Trump administration in DC, and with it increased emphasis on oil and gas development. So the administration says they're planning on ramping up leasing, oil and gas leasing. And so what have you seen, like what changes have been made so far that you can comment on?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, in whatever, it's been 100 days or 105 days or something at this point.
Yeah.
It's mostly a change in tone.
Oh, okay.
They're still working on, finding the right people for these various positions and getting them through the Senate confirmation process. So there's, it's a little bit slow. But Secretary Burgum, I think, is very high quality, and he's very interested. He's from North Dakota, so he gets oil and gas, and he's very interested and really knows, because of his own personal background, how much innovation plays in all of this.
Sure.
How much we can do, and how much oil and gas industry does from an innovation standpoint that can move it forward. And I think what's exciting about the current secretary is, what I see him doing and what I hear in what he says publicly is that he wants to transfer some of that innovative thinking from private sector to how the agency works. So, it's not really all that complicated on the leasing side. What's so weird, I think people think that the federal government has some sort of plan for leasing, that they lease in some way that puts together a contiguous set of land surface where you could put together a drilling program. They don't. They lease these random tiny parcels spread out all over the place, and they end up with all these donut holes of places that aren't leased. And innovating how we do leasing would not be that hard, I don't think. Maybe I'm being Pollyannish about it, but it does take someone at a leadership level to say, this is not working, and we can do it a different way.
Have there always been the donut holes, or is that more recent development? I mean,
well, yeah, I don't know about always, Holly, but it's definitely gotten harder recently. I mean, the lease sales that have happened over the past 4 years have just been just a joke.
Are you sure they didn't have a plan?
They might have had a plan.
Yeah.
They might have been doing that intentionally. That's true. I mean, putting the best construction on it, even before, leasing has always been a little bit just haphazard. There's no rhyme or reason for why some parcels are leased and others aren't. And it's been vexing for quite some time.
Because companies can ask. So companies can ask. And so that's so Superintendent Degenfelder was on this podcast and talking about how it was, over the last 4 years, it was kind of weird how companies would ask and then only select parts of parcels, or it was almost like it was planned to minimize actual functional production and minimize leasing.
Yeah, I think, and part of it honestly is if you lease, if you have these donut holes where you kind of lease everything around it, but the BLM maintains a parcel in the middle of the donut hole that's not leased, it's a way for the department to maintain control of that whole area.
Sure.
Because they know that we can't do really anything. We're not doing vertical wells anymore. We're doing these horizontal wells.
That's what I was going to ask. So it does have that technology part.
That's
maybe
right.
that would have worked if you were just drilling conventional wells straight down. But now if you're going lateral for 3 miles, it doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
And I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist here, but I do think it is a bit about maintaining that control. What some in the federal government want is to make sure that they continue to have a nexus. So if they don't have a nexus, then they don't have as much control over what happens.
Okay.
And that's why the Permian Basin in Texas can just legitimately drill, baby, drill.
Yeah.
Because they don't have that nexus. So, again, there's like Thomas Sowell said, there's no solutions, only trade-offs. And, so we have this amazing thing here where we have these wide open spaces and public lands and multiple use and all that. And that throttles oil and gas a little bit. But, that doesn't necessarily equate to that we can't also do development and do it in a sustainable way.
Got it. So Pete, as I was getting ready for this podcast, actually one of my folks here at the School of Energy Resources who was in Leadership Wyoming told me that I had to ask you about leadership questions. So I want to do that. And so, and by the way, this is a little bit of a random podcast because we cover kind of general energy topics in Wyoming. We also cover innovation here at SCR across the university and across the state. And then we talk about leadership. So
amazing.
Yeah, all things that are interesting and mostly related, and actually leadership impacts everything. So it is related.
I was going to say it's all related.
Yeah, it's all related. So let's talk about leadership a little bit. And number one, like talk about kind of how you think about leadership.
Well, yeah. First of all, it's embarrassing to talk about leadership in front of you.
Stop. No.
Yeah, you're the one. We should turn this around and have me ask you these questions.
That's not how this works.
Yeah,
I
have to start my own podcast.
Yes.
to ask you. Okay,
yeah, when you invite me to your podcast, we can do that.
Did you know? Little did you know we've started a podcast?
No.
Yeah.
When?
We're about to release. It's not really a podcast.
Oh, okay.
We're about to release the first one. It's called Beneath the Surface, and going to be monthly.
Cool.
So So don't worry. I'll get you on.
Okay.
Yeah. So the funny thing about leadership is I honestly, for a very, very long time, I didn't really think about it. I was working in DC, and then working in DC is amazing. I worked for former Representative Lummis, now Senator Lummis, for quite some time. And when you're a staffer for a congressman, what your job is to advance the vision of the congressman. And so if people don't like that vision, fine, but that's not like it's her vision. It's not my.
Right.
You know what I mean? So there's like a little bit of a veil there. And I remember when I came back to Wyoming to take the job of executive director of the Wyoming County Commissioners Association, it's a trade association. It's just all its members are county commissioners. That all of a sudden I was out front more, and the things I was saying and doing were that was me. Like I couldn't turn around and find anybody else who I could hide behind. And so I was in Leadership Wyoming back in 2015. And one of my friends from that class, I just was like, look, I just want to do my work. Why do people have to think too much about what I say? And I was kind of just kind of being a dummy about all of that. and one of my classmates said, look, the sooner you realize that you can't be anonymous anymore, the better. And I took that and started working on it, over years through WCCA and now PAW about what that means. What does that look like? To have, what do you have to do to make sure that if you're not going to be anonymous, what impact are you having on people? What influence are you having on people? And is it in a way that helps to push not only myself to be, a better person, but also the people that I'm interacting with and influencing. What is it that I can do that helps to advance where they are in their lives and their own personal growth? So that's really where it started. And I mean, I can give you a little bit of insight into what I tell the Leadership Wyoming class if you want.
I do.
Okay.
I'm very curious. She told me nothing.
Oh, okay. Nice. Well, so that kind of grew a little bit organically as well. They do a session in Gillette that's about natural resources, and so initially I was just straight oil and gas. And at one point they asked me with 3 days notice, could you weave in some leadership thoughts? And I was like, oh, nice, great. But it was great because it did actually make me think about it, and I kind of built it off of. I just started to really think what is it that I think about leadership, and I boiled it down to these sort of 3 things that seem they're really pedestrian on the surface, but the more you peel away layers, the more there is. So the 3 things I talk about are do the work, and then know yourself, and then strive for joy. Mm-hmm. Those are the 3 things. And the do the work is it can be obvious in terms of just show up to your job and do the work, and relates to being in the legislature and working around the legislatures. It's fascinating to me how, if you just read the materials, how far ahead you are, and people are like, oh my gosh, you know so much. And I just read this stuff.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's kind of funny. So it can be surfacey like that, but then it bleeds into the second one, which I think is perhaps the most important, is the knowing yourself part. And it goes back to what I was saying about the impact and the influence that you have. My honest opinion about this, Holly, is that I think we all of us, we are terrible at understanding our own motivations and our own influences, and particularly terrible at understanding how other people view us and how they are influenced and impacted by us. And you can only really, you can't get to any of that unless you're really intentional about self-observation and using some pretty helpful tools. Leadership Wyoming offers one that help give you language and understanding about yourself, so that you can lead in a way that is authentic, but also recognizes and honors the people that are around you as well, and what their goals and visions and dreams are, and all of that. So that's what I talk about a lot. And the last one was Strive for Joy, which is all of our jobs and everything that we're doing. Happiness kind of comes and goes, I think, but joy is lasting. And
talk about that.
Well, okay. How long?
Okay.
No, we can talk about it. It's maybe my own definition, but you can go have a nice cup of coffee and feel happy, but it's gone, pretty quickly. You can have a great day at work and you feel happy, but what is it? What steps? What actions? What understanding about yourself goes beyond that sort of temporary happiness to a lasting joy that's deeper than just individual actions or influences, and that you actually have to work for. You have to do the work to understand yourself to get to that level, I believe. So we talk about that, and it's been mostly my. It's funny. I joke with the Leadership Wyoming class that I'm giving them a presentation, but I'm mostly talking to myself because joy doesn't come naturally to me. Like I really have to work at it, So it's more like a pep talk for myself. There just happens to be people there, but yeah, that's what I talk about. And this year in particular, your staffer and others seemed to resonate with it. Yeah, and so it was fun. It was fun.
Well, thank you for doing that. I will also add to that. I think like the self-awareness part that you talked about, it doesn't just help you understand yourself, but it helps you understand those around you and kind of surround yourself with people that are different.
Right.
And that makes a really strong team. Like, for example, I am one who gets fixated on the way things should be, right? This should be like this. This should work like this. It would be better if, this was faster. This was more efficient.
Yeah.
And that is great for driving like organizational change and making yourself crazy, right?
right.
But then like I have folks here who are also really good about being like, well, shoot, that should be that way, but it's not the way it is. So let's work through that. And there's definitely days when I have to like let them take the lead and be like, help me here, because I cannot let go that this would be better if it was done this way, but that is outside my sphere of influence, which is something Mandy Fable, the head of Leadership Wyoming, is working with me on, is understanding where that sphere is.
Yeah, and it's like, I mean, you're exactly right, and I think part of it is having a clearer understanding of yourself allows you to have grace for other people, because one of the things I talk about is like, look, the best part of you is also the worst part of you.
Yeah,
they for myself, like big time perfectionist, and very diligent, just work really hard. That's good. That's great. But it also means that I can have blind spots for how that people can see me as closed and, whatever, scary, intimidating, all these words that have been used to describe me, which, I don't love it, but knowing it is sort of the first step to understanding kind of where I am. But then I can turn around and see, my staff or the people I work with, and see kind of the best part of them is also the worst part of them, and just have a little more grace for doing that. Which, I mean, look, if you're going to be successful in an organization like this one or in mine or anything, you don't get to work alone.
Yeah.
You don't get to. There's got to be other people, and they're all going to have their things, and figuring out a path through that to success collectively is it's not easy, but man, it's rewarding.
It is. I think the sense of like, I can't get that much done by myself anyway, Right. So that's why I think it's so important to me and to invest in this space. And also, I will say, I'll never forget, like, as a very young engineer, it like dawned on me that like some people wanted you to like ask them how they were doing or like about their day before you started talking about work. And I was like, why?
I know.
That's really embarrassing, but it's, it just showed, like, I'm just like, I just want to get a lot done and like, be really efficient, but that isn't where everyone's at. And like, even realizing like, I will say our College of Engineering and Physical Sciences has like offered courses and training for faculty and staff on leadership, but generally I did not get any of that. I had a great mentor in my PhD at the University of Oklahoma, but like I didn't have any leadership training. So like that was all like just the realization that like not everyone around me, their brains didn't all work like mine. And I was kind of being a jerk by just like sitting down and be like, okay, let's go. Let's do all this work,
Yeah.
So
yeah, isn't that funny? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's sort of the same. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of in this mindset of, at least before that, like, why can't we just like show up to work and do our work and go home? Like, why do I have to worry about the culture of the place?
Yeah.
But, study after study shows that if you want to try to take the chance of not being intentional about culture, the chances are it's going to be bad.
Yeah.
So
especially in the long term, it just like doesn't work out,
right.
And there's so many reasons for that. But I also think one of the things being here at SCR that we've talked about some is like also now, I don't know, maybe it's just this point in my life, I like don't want to work at a place like that. I want to work at a place that's fun to work at.
Yeah.
And so we kind of all try to contribute to that.
Yeah. Who does wants to work?
Yeah.
I mean,
I want to be
nobody
miserable.
does. It's just that like,
it just can happen.
You look around and you think, well, who's going to do that?
Right.
Well, I mean, it starts with yourself,
right.
No matter where you are, if you're a leader or, you're starting out and you're a subordinate or whatever. It's never too early to start because that, nobody else is going to come in and do any of that for you. So it's got to be yourself.
And you have to give people the grace to kind of to focus on those things,
right.
Right. And to have fun when they're at work. And it's not everywhere. So, but it's sure been rewarding here. So
that's great. I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah. So thank you so much for all you do for us here at School of Energy Resources and for the university. For our last question, it's a little different. So I guess we have 4 topics. We also like to hear about the state of Wyoming as a whole and just ask, like, if you had to choose a place in Wyoming that you would say is like your very favorite place to go visit, what would it be?
Yeah. I've been so lucky to have jobs where I travel around all of Wyoming. And so there's a lot, but I will limit it to my dad grew up in Sheridan and his parents, of course, my grandfather was a Lutheran pastor, and so he moved around a lot. He was in Sheridan for a while. He ended his career in Worland and then retired in Bighorn. And so my growing up from being a little kid all the way through formative high school was either on the western side of the Bighorns or the eastern side of the Bighorns. And that's where I first kind of learned how to fish. That's where I first did like backpacking and all that kind of stuff. And so I still feel like the Bighorns are, when I think about the mountains and kind of being called home to the mountains, I think about the Bighorns. And there's even specific places in the Bighorns if people want to really nerd out on it. But essentially the Cloud Peak Wilderness and the Bighorns, I just love.
Great. That's so awesome. Bighorns are pretty special.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for all you do. And thanks for leading our oil and gas industry here in Wyoming and being such a great player in the state and working with us. And thanks for doing the podcast.
You're welcome. Thanks for all the work you guys do here. It's just invaluable.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape, the podcast that highlights the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. You can expect a new episode of Energy Frontier every other Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.